Hey, well, good morning. It is great to be with you today. We are almost done walking through the book of Colossians, and really what we've tried to do in this series is look at this letter to a small church that was seeking to understand what it looked like for them to be who God had called them to be. For us here at Roswell, this is a year where our vision is that we would be a church that makes disciples as we go, that we would be a people that are focused on growing in our faith, actively living out lives that follow the teachings of Jesus Christ and calling others to know and understand what it means to worship Him as their Savior. And so really, this is a picture of how that happens, of how through the Holy Spirit, which is appropriate on Pentecost to acknowledge, God is in the process of forming us and shaping us and maturing us so that we can live into the richness of the lives that we've been given in Jesus Christ. And we've been walking through the last few weeks in chapter 3 of this picture of how as believers, as followers of Jesus, we've taken off the old, the sinful, the dirty, that which is holding us back, that is inflicting pain on us and on the world around us, and we've discarded those clothes and we've put on the goodness that is ours in Jesus Christ. And last week we talked about how that is an invitation into connection and vulnerability, how that is a call for us to be a people who seek peace and holiness, who seek the voice of God and the good of our neighbors. And so this week we talk about what happens when it gets real. Why is that not so simple? We're going to see that today because there's this reality that we run into. In a fallen world, it is inevitable that as we seek to follow Jesus, we are going to be tripped up by what I think is one of the most attractive and corrupting aspects of the fallen world that we live in. And it's this reality that I think twists us and changes us more than we realize, but we want it more than we want anything else. So here's just a very concrete, simple example of how I've been affected by this. And we'll start simple and then we're going to work our way into a little more complicated. Okay, so when I lived in Indiana, I loved to ride my road bike. I learned very quickly that is a life and death sport to play here in the Atlanta metro area, so I don't do it here. But in Indiana, it was a little bit safer. And so outside of our house, I literally could hop on my road bike in my garage, ride past the Indiana State football stadium, and get on the Heritage Trail, which was this mixed-use trail that you would have bikers and people that walk and run, and they would have dogs. And it would be the most frustrating, annoying part of my ride to be on the Heritage Trail because I'm on my bike. On a good day, 17 to 18 miles an hour. If you ride with Peter Beck, you've got to go at least 25 to keep up with him. But for me, 18 was a good day. And these people would just be in my way. They would give me dirty looks because they felt unsafe when I would ride by them. They would be walking their dog. Their kids wouldn't stay on the right side. I'd have to slow down. I wouldn't make my times that I was aiming for on Strava. I was grossly inconvenienced by their existence. And I found that frustrating. Felt aggressively angsty towards them. They should get out of my way. I'm bigger and I'm faster. I should have the right to do what I want to do, right? So then what would happen is I would get to the end of the Heritage Trail and it spits you out onto these rural roads, which were definitely better than trying to ride my bike in East Cobb, but still, pretty quickly I would get out on these roads and these cars would start driving by me. And suddenly I had a very different kind of angst. They weren't respecting the law that said they needed to give me 3 feet. 3 feet in between the car and the bike. Why? Because I don't want to get hit. They're bigger and faster than me. They're not taking into account my vulnerability. This is a problem. At the end of the day, in both cases, the world is revolving around me, which I think I was an only child, so maybe there's something there. But here's what's so funny. There was a drastic change in my perspective on vulnerability and weakness depending on the position of power I was in. And that is the challenge that we have when we want to put on the new self is what do we do with power? Because there's something about power that changes us. And listen, I don't think it's an accident because even just using this example, when I was in a position of power, I was largely unconcerned with the vulnerability of the weaker people around me. They were an inconvenience to me. They were in my way. They didn't matter because I should have been able to do whatever I wanted. I was operating out of a position of strength. It's funny how you can literally look at the point in a road where I stop operating out of a position of strength and move into a position of weakness, that my care for empathy and caution suddenly increased because it affected me. I think one of the dangers in power is that it makes us safe. It gives us a feeling of control. We naturally tend to be less empathetic when we are operating out of a position of power because suddenly empathy and safety don't matter as much to us. We've created it because we're operating out of a position where we can protect ourselves. And because of that, when you look at just in this example, those two places that I was living, we as a people have been and will be in a constant state of trying to make sure that we are operating out of position one. We want to operate out of a position of power because it is safe and it benefits us. There is this natural gravity in humanity that we want to be in a position of strength and safety. And as we're going to see, this wasn't just a problem for us. This was a problem for the early church as well. And ironically, Jesus spent a great deal of time talking about power and how we should treat it. And what we're going to see today is really, Scripture is echoing the life of Jesus, and that our call as believers, as people formed in Christ, is to make some exchanges in how we treat power. There is a way that the world treats power, and there is a way that as Christians we are called to treat power. And what Paul is going to do is he's specifically going to get into this household code and look at power dynamics in the home. And I'm going to say at work, but we'll get into that. But he's going to get into these ideas of how we treat power. And what's going to happen as we read this, it's going to be tempting for us to make this about domestic roles. And we'll get into why that's such an easy temptation. It's actually a lot bigger than domestic roles. He's simply painting pictures in the places that power dynamics are most commonly going to run up against sin. It's about more than our roles as husbands and wives and parents and children and slaves and masters. It's really about what we do with power. Are we a people who make the exchange that Christ made, or are we a people that decide that we're going to treat power the way the world treats power? It's the question in front of us. And what we want to do in each one of these cases is look at three different realities. We want to look at the way that Christ treated this exchange. We want to look at the exchange we're being called to make. Then we want to look at what that means for us today. So let's jump into Colossians 3. And I'm going to caution us because we're going to try to pick up a shield and a sword and have an argument right at the beginning. We want to diffuse and disarm that. And ironically, the reason we want to do that is because the very nature of this passage that is so controversial illuminates why it's so important that we read this. So let's jump in here. Wives, submit to your husbands. That's why we didn't do this for Mother's Day. As is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Okay, let's just stop because this is exchange number one. This is, let's just be honest, a tense, blunt passage that is pretty offensive in culture today, right? Like, we're literally having this conversation because of a kicker on a football team right now on the Today Show. This is an incredibly, incredibly touchy passage with good reason. This is a passage that has been used to perpetuate the abuse and mistreatment of women in multiple contexts, in multiple places, in multiple cultures. So what do we do with this? How is this here? What is he saying? So let's talk about who he's writing to, and let's talk about why we don't want to fall into the trap of making this an argument just yet. At the time, there was a household code in Roman society that was pretty simple. There was a freedman, if you were free, at the top of the power structure. Pretty much everything else was property for you as a freedman. Women didn't have rights, they couldn't own property, they certainly couldn't vote. Most men couldn't vote either, for that matter. But literally everything in a Roman household code revolved around the man being in charge and everyone doing whatever he said no matter what, or he could kill them or sell them. It was not a nuanced system. This is very simple. This is the world the church was operating in. So two things are interesting about this. Two things about this are instantly countercultural as you read this. The fact that Paul is addressing women at all is very different because other household codes only talk to the men, and it basically said, men, you're in charge. So the fact that women are addressed is unusual. The fact that children and slaves are going to be addressed, highly unusual. Here's the second thing that's unusual about this. It's the second line. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. For us, we're like, isn't that common sense? Like, do we need to tell people that? The fact that this was in here was so controversial because up until this point, a Roman ethic, a worldly ethic, was a one-way street. The person with power was in charge, and that was it. That was the end of it. The fact that this is inviting a man and a woman into mutual sacrifice, mutual love, and mutual responsibility was drastically different than anything that these people had been told up to this point by the world that they lived in. So here's the reality as we get ready to dig into the exchange that we're being called to make here. Here's why I don't want us to get into the typical argument here. Well, who has to submit? Does the man submit? Does the woman submit? Are we complementarian? Are we egalitarian? Listen, here's the reality. Complementarian and egalitarian, that's what we call a secondary issue. There are people who are Christians that hold to both of those views. We have people in this church that hold to both of those views. Here's what happens if we solely focus on who has to submit first. We miss what this is actually calling us to because we want to argue about who's in charge. The funny thing is, if we really want to ask the question, who submits first? Jesus submitted first. So if we have been formed by the Spirit and we're following Jesus, who is in charge is not the question that we should be asking. The question that we should be asking is, what does it look like for me to lovingly submit to the person that God has put me with? So here's the exchange we're called to make. We're called to step out of authority into vulnerability, out of status into vulnerability. So listen, if you were a husband at the time, you had a status in your household. Paul's actively saying you don't live out of the status that the world has called you to. The idea of loving your wife and not being harsh with her would have been an expectation that was novel to many people that had grown up in the world's power structure then. This idea that you would have to be anything other than however you wanted to be to someone underneath you did not exist. So what he's actually telling the husbands, and Ephesians actually gives us a little more detail on this. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So what's interesting is he's actually calling the husband and the wife out of a worldly model of power that said the person with power does whatever he wants and everybody else just deals with it, into this idea of mutual submission. So what did this look like for Jesus? The incarnation is Jesus modeling exchanging status for vulnerability. And throughout the Gospels, you see this picture of the magnitude of what Jesus did by coming to earth and living the life that he lived for our salvation. The status that Jesus has is the firstborn of creation, sovereign over everything of all time, living in the perfection of heaven, in the presence and complete unity with the Trinity. Over and over and over again in Scripture, you see this theological reality that Jesus willingly stepped out of the status that he had and made himself vulnerable and lived amongst us. Why did he do that? Why did he do that? Ultimately, the accumulation and exercise of power for his means was not what Jesus saw as good. It is not what God designed as perfect and holy. So when we look at power, the first exchange that we're called to make here really shouldn't start with a question of who's in charge. If you're asking that question, you've already missed the point. The question should be, what does it look like for me to exchange status with vulnerability? How do I step out of a status of being in charge into serving and being vulnerable? Let's look at that. So we have these three pictures here that I think Paul gives us. Number one is to actually recognize power dynamics. Listen, I think a lot of times this is something we have a vague awareness of, but I'm not sure that we really name the elephant of the room or even understand what it means to have power. I don't think it's something that we always really think about. And so the question for us to ask really, as we think about being vulnerable, is where am I in a position where I have power and authority over someone else? How does that affect them? How am I in a place where me being careless could end up injuring the soul of someone underneath me? And frankly, this is within the house, but this is also bigger than just our marital relationships. I think a marriage relationship is a great place to start asking this question, for sure. But the broader issue of power, really, this is applicable in any point of your life. So what are the power dynamics where you live? Where are there places that you are in authority? Where are there places where you aren't in authority? And we'll get into this, but this is another consistent theme here. He actually opens it with wives, submit to your husbands, which, again, at the time, remember, he's speaking to women in a system at the time. These women might not have been married to Christians. We don't really know who they were married to. It's likely that not every woman in this congregation was married to a guy that was a Christian. And he seems to be saying that there is something in, as believers, us having a humility to submit, engage, and sync up with the people around us. There's something of the grace of God that is reflected in us being a people who don't seek to overbear and control and manipulate, but rather a people that sync up and seek peace. And it's so interesting that when you read in Genesis 3, one of the first implications of sin, one of the first consequences of the brokenness of sin in the world was that the man and the woman would have an enmity between one another, and they would constantly try to dominate the other. And really, it's not just men and women, it's all of us have this enmity where there's this race for safety and power. And so I think it's wise of us to think through where we have spaces that we could, if we're unaware, be in a position to hurt people with power. Here's the second one. If we are treating power correctly, if we are really exchanging status for vulnerability, we really need to strive to serve, not to win. And again, I think this is the picture of the incarnation. You understand the incarnation of Jesus was not an upgrade for his life outside of heaven, right? Like, we do get that, okay? And to me, I'm still fascinated at the depth that he lowered himself. When you think of all of the places and all of the times Jesus could have been incarnate here on earth, he picked when he did, where he did. It was not like, it wasn't clean. They didn't have air conditioning or medicine. He wasn't even in like the nice part of the first century, right? He could have been born in a Roman senator's house and at least had hot water. He literally sought to serve in every single way. So in our marriage relationships, and let's just go out from there, when we think about exchanging status for vulnerability, really that's rooted in striving to serve, not to win. Ultimately, what is the orientation of your heart? Because what happens when we are vulnerable instead of seeking status is we're not trying to win. We don't need power to keep us safe because we don't need power to serve. I think about the picture that I saw of this serving, not winning in my granddad. So I grew up as an only grandchild. My grandparents pretty much raised me when my single mom was at work. She was a teacher. And I would watch my granddad, and he was like, and it's so funny to me because you get all of these kind of cultural shadings of what masculinity is. And my granddad checked all of them for our country. He fought in 2 wars. He was an accomplished marksman in the Army. I have a shelf full of his medals. He was an engineer at IBM that did incredibly well, helped invent the laser printer, was in combat, was big and strong, and had some adventures that I probably can't talk about from here. Picture of typical mid-century American masculinity. So here's what I saw my granddad do. Every single day, he was washing dishes for my grandma. Every single day, he brought flowers home for her. As she got older, he drove her to what she called the beauty shop, which if you're under a certain age, it's where you get your hair done. He made sure that she had what she wanted. If she looked at something, he usually bought it. Everything that he did in his marriage relationship was a posture of humility and service. This was at a time when a lot of men culturally didn't wash dishes. This was a time when guys didn't necessarily help out around the house. He still did it. Why did he do that? Ultimately, my grandparents' relationship was not built around who gets to be right and get what they wanted. I'll tell you who got what they wanted, my grandmother. Why? Because my granddad's ultimate heart for her was, how do I serve her? How do I put her first? And it wasn't just with her. He did this with everyone. Anyone that was around him would tell you that he'd always help you out in whatever you needed. When the high school kids that ran with my uncle would get in trouble, they knew to come to my granddad and he'd help bail them out. There's, again, more stories I can't tell here. But everyone who knew him knew that he was going to help you out. He was somebody with a claim to some power and some status. He continued to step out of that. Ultimately, he wanted to serve people. So listen, if we want to be Christ-formed disciples, we look at the way that Christ treated his status as a second person of the Trinity, as the Son of God. When he came to earth, he didn't come as royalty. He didn't come as wealthy. He didn't come as someone who was seeking influence. He literally came and lived as a servant. Here's the last one, and it's really intimately connected here. We want to act out of love, not in a personal agenda. So many times the reason that we like power, the reason that it's so addictive, is because it helps us get what we want. It's how we get from point A to point B. It's how we feel safe and fulfilled. Listen, part of the scary aspect of this exchange is that when we put down power, we put down our ability to drive our agenda. And that's terrifying. Like, legitimately, that is scary for us to do, isn't it? We put ourselves in a position where we might not be in a place to get exactly what we want, when we want, how we want, the way we want it, which is kind of the American dream. So when we put down status and pick up vulnerability, that frees us up to be a people who act out of love. So often where we get sideways with people and what stops us from making this trade is what it might cost us. Vulnerability might cost us our pride. It might cost us financially. It might cost us our career. It might cost us our comfort. But at the end of the day, when we act out of love and not an agenda, we are modeling what Christ-centered treatment of power looks like. Our power does not exist for us to accumulate and use to our own ends. If we want to be a people that are healthy relationally, that are putting on the new self, we've got to take an honest look at how we view power. Are we a people that chase status, or can we set our status down and step away from that? Whatever that looks like. The specific area that he's talking about here in these two verses are for husbands and wives in the first century. He's saying, stop playing this game of who gets to be in charge. There was a weight to the husband's leadership, to be sure. Paul's saying, hey, if you really want to be the person that's responsible, you better love your wives the way Christ loved the church. You better go first in your sacrifice. And listen, I'll just tell you this, regardless of what secondary stance you hold on this issue, anybody who comes into any type of relational exposition and application of Scripture that does not start with sacrificial service, you're already doing it wrong. We don't oppress people in the name of God, regardless of their gender, because that can cut both ways probably, but we've got to remember that ultimately the call for us here is to put down status and labels and pick up vulnerability, because that's what Christ did. No one made a bigger sacrifice of status than Jesus Christ, because none of us can make a claim to being sovereign over everything in creation and then willingly give that up, right? The biggest step down that we've ever seen in the history of the world was Jesus Christ coming to earth as fully man and fully God. He models for us putting down and stepping away the status that allows us to get what we want. Here's the second place we see this happen. He says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. So let's talk about this one too, because listen, as a parent, we all are familiar with the futility of trying to exercise our authority as parents to get our kids to do what we want them to do. We've all been there. And we love the first part of this verse. We're like, yes, can this be the memory verse every week in kids? Obey your parents in everything, even when we ask you to clean your room. Can you obey us? It's really interesting when you see this here. Again, like, there were very different standards of how it was acceptable to treat your children in the first century. And so if you did not obey your parents, it was really unpleasant, and no one cared. It was just the way the world worked. And so, again, this is a little bit of a liberal, shocking perspective on parenting in the Roman world, because he's saying, hey, you need to obey your parents. Why? It pleases the Lord. Not because it'll keep you safe, not because it's the right thing to do, not because it will advance you socially and your parents have a lot of good ideas, but because the Lord is pleased by a reflection of the way he's called us to live. So that in and of itself, shocking, right? Second thing that's shocking, don't provoke your children because they might be discouraged. A Roman parent might say, that's the point. Listen, this was an honor-driven society, and everything that you were after as a parent of children, especially if you were a freed person in Rome, was for your children to advance the name of your family. Ultimately, you wanted your family name and honor advanced. It reflected on who you were as a parent. I know that we don't have those kind of issues today at Travel Sports, but at the time, it was a really big deal that children reflected well on their parents. And so what would inevitably happen, just like we do, is parents would sometimes act not out of love and selflessness in how they called their children to act, but rather out of fear, anxiety, and even sometimes anger, because ultimately something about their children's behavior was reflecting back on them. And so what's the exchange here? Because we'd say, yeah, what's the problem? Kids just need to do what we tell them, right? Okay. What does it mean when it says don't discourage your children? Here's the call for us as parents. And really, not just parents, because think back to the power dynamics. Anyone that you maybe have authority over, if you're discouraging them, you might have left obedience, because here's the exchange that he's calling people to. He's saying step out of authority and into servant leadership. There are power dynamics that are good. It's not inherently evil that parents have authority over their kids. It's probably a good idea. We can help them grow and understand who they are in Jesus Christ. That's a good thing. I love the picture of Jesus as a servant that you see when Satan comes and tempts him in the desert. And there's two really interesting realities about Jesus being tempted by Satan in the desert. Number one is everything that Satan tempts him with are all things Jesus could have done for himself, right? Like literally everything. Jesus needed Satan's permission for nothing. He already had the power to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. So it's funny that the temptations that Satan brought were things that Jesus had already willingly walked away from. The second interesting aspect of it is everything that Satan tempted Jesus with was ultimately a result of Jesus using his power for his own good, elevation, and comfort, instead of using his power for the good of humanity. Every single temptation. And what you see out of Jesus here is that in his rejection of the temptations of Satan, he is saying something about what he came to earth to use his power for. If it was me, I'm 100% going to be tempted to use my power for my own good. He was fasting for 40 days, right? Like, he's in a weak place. He's willingly stepping away from that which gives him nourishment and comfort. And in that space, when he's probably the most tired and vulnerable, Satan's like, hey, look at all the stuff you could have. And he's like, no, that's not what I'm about. Again, I am fascinated and humbled by the ability of Jesus Christ in the midst of being persecuted and crucified to not snap his fingers and just murder everybody that made fun of him. That self-restraint is only a result of his divinity and perfection, right? I don't think any of us would be able to restrain ourselves if we had the power to stop people from hurting us, but he did. Why? Ultimately, Jesus did not view power as something to use for himself. He saw it as something to leverage for the purpose and mission that he'd been given on earth, right? So I want us to think about this. What's the purpose of our position? We are in positions of authority, whether it's parents, whether it's work. We have these spaces in our life where we're in authority. What is the purpose of your position? I could be wrong. I am not aware of any positions that are created solely for the benefit and elevation of the person in authority. There's always a mission outside of the individual in leadership, isn't there? Whether you're at a company, whether you're at home, whether you're whatever, there is not a position of authority that in theory, some people are like, yeah, you don't know my boss. Okay, yeah, that would be an example of what's unhealthy, right? But there is not a job description that says the purpose of this role is for you to enrich yourself. So what is the purpose of your position? Let's go back to the dynamic that he's speaking on here. As parents, what is the purpose of our position? When we think about our kids and how we interact with them, what is the ultimate purpose that God has called us to as parents? Is it to make sure that our kids get good grades, act right, and get into a good school? Or is it to build them up in their understanding of who they are in Jesus Christ and what it means to know him? If we are consistently discouraging, and hear me, I'm not saying that we shouldn't discipline our children. That's not what this is saying. This idea of discouraging them literally means to put them into the ground, to run over them, to crumble, to kind of grind them up. Are we a people who are exercising our authority in a way that is breaking down our kids' understanding of who they are and what it means to be loved by God? Do we recognize the purpose of our position? If we want to be servants, then we've got to recognize those places where we hold some power and say, I'm not going to use this for my own benefit and comfort. I'm going to put this down and walk away from it. Second place that we go with this is we direct our power towards that purpose. This isn't bad. As parents, if we have power and authority that we've been given over our children, and our purpose as parents is to shepherd their hearts towards the Lord and understand who they are in Him, then we want to use the power that we have for that specific purpose. That's a great guardrail against discouragement. No one in this room would actively strategize using their power to help their kids know Jesus in a way that ends with them yelling at their kids, you better know Jesus or else. None of us would willingly do that. But our kids don't listen to us 4 times in a row, watch what happens. Right? It's so easy for us to lose sight of our purpose when we get impatient or frustrated, and when we just want our kids to make our life easier. It's important that we remember, as parents, we don't want to discourage our kids. We want to shepherd them towards Jesus. We want to direct our power towards the purpose, and there is going to automatically be a lowering of ourselves when that happens. So again, just a beautiful picture of this. It's not even in this specific realm, but my uncle, my mom's brother, he built up an air conditioning company that I'm biased, would say was wildly successful. And he was the owner, he was the boss, controlled everything. In his late 50s, when he was in charge, he would still be down on the floor helping the 20-year-old guys load these 200-pound air conditioning units into trucks. He'd be going on service calls, crawling through tubes. Why? He was the owner. He didn't have to do that. Well, he saw the purpose of his role. He saw the reason that he was there, to serve and equip his people to do what they wanted to do. Ultimately, he was able to say, this is the purpose that I'm here for. What does it look like for me to use the power I have to accomplish that purpose? He wasn't too big and too good to do the dirty work. He wasn't above anybody. He saw himself as a servant. So whatever needed to be done, he'd do it. I think that's kind of what Jesus is telling us here, and how he treated these temptations to use his power for his own good. So in this exchange, we've got to ask, if we're going to be a Christ-formed people in how we treat power, how do we get our arms around those places of power we have and use it to serve other people? I mean, as parents, how are we serving our children and how we lead them? Don't mix up what I'm saying. I'm not saying our kids should be treated like royalty with no rules. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. But if we're not discouraging them, what does it look like for us to be servant leaders in our homes? What does it look like for us to be servant leaders in our jobs, in our careers? Where are those places that we can kind of twist, though? Because if you think, how does the world view power? Everything is about what it can do for you. What perks do I get out of this job? How do I maximize my expense account? How do I maximize my salary? How do I maximize my influence in my pool? We're supposed to do this backwards. So it starts at home, but again, this really is applicable everywhere in your life. Let's look at the last one, because the last one, honestly, I think is the most challenging for us. It's the weirdest one to apply, but the heart of what it's saying is going to be the most offensive to us. So just prepare yourselves, okay? So let's read this last one. He says, bondservants, slaves, also an appropriate translation there. Obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord, not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you have a master in heaven. Okay, so this is really difficult for us because we read this and we're like, but slavery's wrong. Why didn't Paul tell the slaves to rise up and kill their masters? Why didn't he tell the masters to free the slaves or else? This just makes no sense to us. Culturally, it is literally baked into our DNA as Americans that if we don't like something, we'll just start a revolution, get rid of the T, and do our own thing. This is wildly offensive. The idea that we wouldn't just kick over a system that we don't like does not jive with who we are. So let's do a little bit of work on this because it's interesting. Let's start with masters. It's interesting to me what he says to the masters. Again, this would have been revolutionary to hear because these people were property. They had no rights. They could be freed maybe one day. And when you read our extra biblical history, there were masters that treated their slaves well. There were masters that didn't, and there was a lot of in between. And so he says, treat your bondservants or your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you have a master in heaven. This is interesting because here's what he's telling the people in charge here. He's saying, hey, you need to understand that you are being held responsible for the way you treat the people underneath you. Remember, you have someone who is over you in heaven. If you were someone who had slaves, what did obedience to this look like? That's a heavy, weighty responsibility. If we're in a position of authority, and again, the best we can do practically here is probably our jobs. It's not perfect, but I think it's helpful for us to think through the power dynamics here. If you are someone's boss, how do you treat them? If you hold power over someone, how do you treat them? Are you reflecting the goodness of God and how you treat those that have been placed underneath you? Here's the really hard one, though, is it's for the slaves. Is, man, you've got to obey somebody, but slavery's not right. Why would we do that? It's interesting that he says, work for the Lord. You're not working for man, you're working for the Lord. You want to be faithful to where you have been called. Ultimately, it seems that, and this is where I think this is going to be hard for us to get our minds around. It would seem that Paul's ultimate goal for the people that he's writing to is not the elevation of their status, but rather the obedience and health of their souls. And so here's the last exchange, and this is the hard one for us to hear. We've got to exchange the pursuit of power for the pursuit of obedience. And again, you saw Jesus do this on the cross. Like, ultimately, the cross is the apex of this. Everything about the cross was obedience for Jesus Christ. There was no earthly victory for him in that. There was no comfort or pleasure. There was no elevation for him in the cross. It was the opposite. He died a humiliating, painful criminal's death with no honor. Why? Because he was being obedient to the mission of the Father to die on the cross for the sins of us, to save our souls and to give us life that we could not get otherwise. Jesus put down the pursuit of power in the name of his ultimate goal, which was obedience to the Father. So that frames Paul's commands to those who were enslaved a little bit differently, right? Ultimately, Paul's concern was not the elevation of people's social status, it was the health of their souls. And he's saying, listen, obedience is the target, not social betterment. Obedience is the target. Well, what about the unjust system? You're right. Remember what he said to the slave owners. He said, you better treat people justly and fairly. Is slavery just and fair? Absolutely not. There is an inherent gravity of Christianity that makes slavery unacceptable. And there is a very strong historical case to be made that Christianity and Christian thought was responsible for the erasure of slavery in the ancient world and also in the modern world. It's very difficult to get around that historically. But ultimately, as he's talking to the people that are working for others, that are being subjugated, that are maybe being treated unfairly, he says, hey, don't look for power, look for obedience. This is the most difficult exchange for us because all of us are like, man, if I just had some power, I'd use it the right way. And for centuries, the church has unfortunately been a poor example of this because we continue to bump our heads into the wall of this belief that if we can just get enough power, we'll use it for the good of others. We'll be different than literally everyone else who has tried this. There's a reason that when you look at history, the bad kings far outweigh the number of good kings. We don't handle power well as sinful people. It is not the ultimate goal of the heart of a Christian. It will corrupt us. So our family has a tradition, family movie nights on Fridays. We do frozen pizza, we watch movies. I'm going to be honest, when we can find one that everybody agrees on, that's a great day because we have myself, my wife, who has a very different taste in movies generally than I do. I don't like to watch sad stuff. She does. I'm not interested in sad. That's another issue for me to work on. Then we have a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old. So you have 4 very different perspectives on what is an acceptable movie to watch. When we find one that everybody's on board with, those are good days. When we find a trilogy, that's even better. And so we've been watching Lord of the Rings for the last 3 weekends. And it is amazing when you watch Lord of the Rings. If you're not familiar, it's a fantasy world. I'm just going to walk you through this briefly. I know it sounds ridiculous. the movie does a better job. Somebody somebody made a ring that's in charge of everything, okay? Just stick with it. And if you have this ring, you can do a lot of cool stuff and be very powerful. The problem is, if the bad eye gets the ring, then he's gonna the Nazis win, okay? That's the end of the movie. And so this hobbit, which is like a dwarf with hairy feet, has to throw the ring in this evil fire to get rid of it. Here's the problem. Everybody who touches the ring that can control everything turns evil. And it's this beautiful picture of what power does. Everybody thinks they can handle it. Hey, if I had the ring, I'd beat the bad guys and we'd be good. The natural gravity of power is that we don't handle it well. But something in us thinks, if I can just get more power, then I would do it right. Scripture says the pursuit and accumulation of power is toxic to your souls because it numbs your ability to empathize and put others first. It is corrosive. It's why that when we read this, we have so much yuck in us. The idea that we would put down the pursuit of power is counterintuitive to everything that we've been taught, even in the church. I grew up in an age of parachurch ministries in high school. It's like, if we can just get the popular cool kids, then everybody else will follow them, and everybody will be a Christian. Because that's what Jesus did and how he selected his disciples, right? It's not. And so we kind of have to just undo so much reflex that's been baked into us. And it starts with this exchange right here. We've got to stop pursuing power above obedience. So here's some checks for you. Here's some questions. What are you doing in the name of the Lord? Paul's commands to these people are, do what you're doing like you're working for God, because he's put you in a place for a reason. So where's God put you? What has he called you to do? What does faithful obedience look like where you are? Even when it's hard, even when it's unfair, even when you don't like it, what does it look like for you to be faithfully obedient in the place that God has put you? Where are you called to sacrifice? You can't make this trade-off without it costing you, right? Because of who Christ is and what he's called us to, we believe the trade-off is worth it. What has Christ called you to sacrifice? Is it your popularity in the name of obedience? Is it finances in the name of obedience? Is it a promotion at work need to go away so you can get more time with your family, being obedient to the first two boxes that we walk through in exchanges? Well, I don't know. I don't know what that looks like for you. What are you called to sacrifice? I'll tell you one of the hardest sacrifices that we made. It might sound silly to you. It was a big deal for us. When we moved from Indiana, we loved our house. My wife loves old homes. Again, I was raised by my granddad, so when my wife wants something, I just get it for her and don't ask questions. That's what I was taught. And so she had this old home, Chicago brick, everything, hardwood floors. Still can't look at pictures of it. Man, that was a tough sacrifice. It's like, God's calling us to be at RCC. We believe this is where we're supposed to be. We have to leave our home. God, how are you going to compensate me for this? So do I get the bigger, better home if I move? That's not how it works. As Christians, we just believe the sacrifices are worth it. So what are you being called to sacrifice? We don't talk about giving a lot here for a reason. It's been abused quite a bit. But again, financially, what has God called you to sacrifice in generosity? Maybe it's not even to the church. Maybe there's just literally someone in your neighborhood that needs groceries or something. I don't know. Where has God called you to sacrifice as we lay down the pursuit of power and pick up the pursuit of obedience? Here's the last question for us as we think about what we're pursuing here. What's the treasure that you're chasing? That Lord of the Rings movie, everybody wants the ring. Everybody wants power. What is that manifestation for you? What are you chasing? Is it a title? Is there something that you believe when you get that? I remember being young in ministry. It's like, man, when I'm a senior pastor, my life will be better. Those titles that we think are going to give us this validation and justification that only comes through Jesus Christ, like they're mirages of something. And they get in the way of obedience so often. What is the treasure that you're chasing? Is it the dream neighborhood? Is it the perfect family? Is it like a really nice car? And I get it. I see them around here, and it's almost good enough, isn't it? What is that treasure that you're chasing? That you're like, if I get this, that'll make me safe. If I get this, that'll make me enough. If I get this, then I'll be able to do what God's called me to. I don't know what that treasure for you is, but I bet you there's a power dynamic in there somewhere, isn't there? Because it makes us safe. makes us feel powerful, makes us feel like we can save ourselves. The gospel calls us to put that down and walk away and say, listen, obedience and pursuit of God, his will, and his commandments are better for our souls than the pursuit of power. And it's going to cost us, but we believe that it's worth it. Because it frees us up to be people who submit, serve, and love one another. It frees us up to be a people who worship and trust in the Lord despite our circumstances. Most importantly, it brings us into an advanced place of intimacy with our Father. Because all of the mess that we're chasing suddenly takes a backseat to the time, focus, and attention we have on the person of Jesus Christ. And so, as we wrestle with these spaces, as we look at this passage that was written to a society that in a lot of ways was very different than ours, in some ways was the same, the question that we've got to ask is, what does it look like for us to walk away from the world's power dynamics? What does it look like to trust that the Lord is enough? What does it look like to be a people who choose obedience over power? We're reminded of our ability to do this at the table, because this is a picture of Jesus stepping out of his status into vulnerability, being a servant leader, and exchanging power for obedience through his death on the cross. And so if you're a believer, if you've put your faith in Jesus, we'd invite you to celebrate this reminder today. It grounds us in our identity, and it helps us be a people that walk away from power and pursue obedience. And so as we prepare to celebrate this, would you pray with me? God, I thank you for your word, that even where it can be difficult to understand, where it can be challenging, you are clear in your love for us and your call for us to follow you. So God, I pray that we would be a people who just rejects the way that the world retreats power, that we would be a church that puts down status, puts down safety, and picks up obedience and love and sacrifice. God, I pray that we would be a reflection of your goodness, which we've experienced through Jesus Christ. It's in his name we pray. Amen.